All right, guys, build show today. Something a little bit different. On the Roseburg stage at the International Builder Show, myself, Bryan Uhler, and Will King got a chance to talk for 45 minutes, kind of off the cuff, on what's new in engineered lumber and how do we use it. And the three of us are very different builders in terms of how we build, our clientele, that sort of thing. So this is the full talk. It's a little bit unscripted, a little bit off the cuff. I think this is almost a little bit podcast style. But forgive us if we've got some crazy sound. This was, like I said, filmed from the crowd at the International Builder Show. With that being said, today's build show, the Roseburg booth on engineered lumber. Let's get going.
Build show here at the Roseburg stage. Let me make some introductions. My name is Matt Reisinger. I'm a builder down in Austin, Texas. And I am the OG build show, but I have some build show friends with me. Let me introduce you, Bryan Uhler from Seattle. You consider yourself Seattle, right?
Yeah, Western Washington. Yep.
So Bryan's with Pioneer Builders, also shoots videos for us on buildshownetwork.com. And Bryan is a pretty interesting contractor to have on stage because they actually do their own framing in-house, so I'm really excited to talk about that. And there's a famous framer in the crowd as well. You may know him as Awesome Framers, but his actual name is Tim. Don't call him Awesome Framers. Just say Tim. Tim's here as well.
Or Timmy. He also goes by Timmy.
Which is actually, if you didn't know this, that's Bryan's brother. It's a family-owned company, like many of your family-owned companies. And then speaking of family-owned companies, I've got also Will from High Cotton Homes, and you guys have probably seen Will on Build Show Network as well. Will, tell us briefly about your company and where you guys are operating.
Yeah, thank you. Check. Can you hear me? Yep. So High Cotton is in northwest Alabama in a city called Florence. No? Try it one more time. Okay. So High Cotton Homes is in Florence, Alabama, northwest corner of the state. We're a design build, home building company. Been a contributor with Matt since September of last year.
And we're sure glad to have you.
We're glad to be here.
All right, so today's topic, engineered versus solid sawn. What's the differences? Where have we used them with success? And also, I'm going to be really honest with you. There's some places where you don't want to use engineered lumber as well, and we're going to talk about that. So first off, Bryan, I want to talk to you about how long you've used engineered lumber. You know, when was the first time you actually tried something that wasn't solid sawn? And it's also interesting as we talk about lumber and our experiences in lumber. I've built now in 3 parts of the country. I built in Washington, D.C., and then I built in Portland, Oregon, and I've been in Texas now for quite a few years. It's interesting, and I didn't realize this as a younger builder, that our lumber packages typically are from sources that are fairly close to where we are. So, for instance, Will and I often frame with SPF lumber, solid sawn SPF, spruce pine fir, which is often grown in the South. When I was up by you, we used a lot of Douglas fir. Is that still the case for you guys up in Seattle?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, they're LVLs. Some of them are spruce pine fir, and some of them are Doug fir, or whatever it was. So yeah, they've got 2 plants, so they use the material that's regional in the fabrication of their engineered product.
That's pretty cool. And as we talk about Roseburg, this is a company that's really a big plywood company, for lack of a better term. So when we look at their products, you're going to see a lot of plies, which is a very strong and a very old technology. But Bryan, when was the first time you used something besides solid sawn on a project?
Well, when you think about it, we're standing on a deck right now that's plywood. Mm-hmm. That's a man-made product.
Sure.
So Dad's here. He started the company in '78. So, 50 years we've used it. But what would you say was the first time you used I-joist, Timmy? 20 years ago? Yeah, 2001, so 21 years ago.
So 20 years ago was when you first went from a solid sawn joist to an I-joist. That's really an interesting intro, and as I think about my career, I started as a production builder. I worked for a big national builder, East Coast, where we didn't have engineered anything. We only had solid 2x 8, 10, and 12, let's say, floor joists. And I remember my job as a young assistant superintendent, I was in my 20s, one of my big jobs was to take an 8-foot level on all our floors, slide that level down and see where the humps were, And then here's how we fixed them. We'd find a hump. I'd mark it with some spray paint on the floor. And then we'd have one guy up and one guy down. And one guy down would take that joist and cut it in half at the center of the joist. And then one guy would do this. And you'd hear this, and then the floor would all of a sudden go a little more level. And then we'd sister on with, a piece of 2x8, let's say, probably not even any glue, and I'm sure 3 nails. And that's how we fixed our floors that were humped. So for all those years I worked for that production builder, all we did was solid sawn, and then we had commodity OSB was our decking. And let me tell you, those were squeaky houses. Those were unlevel houses. It was a total game changer when I first started using engineered products in probably the late 90s when I started doing what I would consider semi-custom homes. Was that your experience as well when you moved to engineer, that all of a sudden you saw flatter floors and less floor squeaks?
Yeah, in fact, I was thinking of a project that we just did, 2x12 rafters, stick built, but you get so much crowning sometimes. So Timmy fixed the roof plane side, but we didn't think about the underside where the crown is for the drywaller. So guess what I heard about? From the drywaller, you had the bow on the inside. So yeah, you just get so much more stability and planability when it comes to this type of a product.
All right, Will, let me switch to you. We talked floor joists. Let's talk about wall studs.
Yep.
Have you used anything besides solid sawn on any of your walls before?
We have, yeah. We started using engineered like LSL studs, for example, back, 3 or 4 years ago, for anything that has a cabinet on it, in any bathroom, all our kitchens, and then any stairwell walls, tall walls, we started swapping over to that, just so, to his point, you didn't see the big hump in the drywall anymore in that 14-foot stairwell. So that's been common for us for a few years, but yeah.
So for me, the big change to engineered wall studs came when I started doing more and more modern houses. When you're doing modern houses, we had level 5 sheetrock, smooth walls, a lot of raking light from modern houses. You might have that big transom window that's right up against the wall that all of a sudden is raking that light down the wall. And when we were framing with standard lumber, any small imperfections in that smooth wall would really show up with that raking light. And so we did it we moved to, I should say, engineered studs in a lot of places for that raking light and that ability to have a really, really smooth wall. The other thing we did pretty early on was we started framing kitchens and bathrooms in engineered studs, again, because we just knew everything that came off the stud pack, if it was engineered, was going to be perfectly dead flat and dead level. Have you guys done any of that, Brian? I'm curious, because you guys aren't typically doing, $10 million custom homes. You're doing, more everyday priced houses, right? Are you using any engineered in your projects for studs?
When it comes to the studs, I don't know that it's all the time, but you can get such long lengths with them. And a lot of times when Timmy does our rake walls, those gable end studs are so long, and he pre-builds them on the floor. Sometimes he'll put the window in, the siding, and all of that. It makes it so much stiffer when he uses our forklift to lift it up into place. So that's one of the big things is they can just keep making this as long, as you can ship it,
Right.
pretty much. So you get so much more of that ability as opposed to super long studs that might get more squirrely.
Yeah, we were talking to the Roseburg guys earlier, and what were some of the lengths they were talking about that you could get the Roseburg engineered LVL studs in? You remember,
60,
Will?
40 or 60 feet, up to. They can make
Up to
it,
60 feet long. Now, that's a long stud. 60. I think he actually said 66 feet was the longest they make. Now, they're probably not going to truck a 66-foot 2x4 by 66 to your job site, but they can custom cut those. Do you remember what he was talking about with that, Will?
Yeah, basically the local distributor would just custom cut them to whatever. So if you needed if you had a 10-foot wall and you needed a whole bundle of them, they would just have to cut them for you at your distributor and then ship them out to your job sites. But let's talk about exterior walls though, with that LSL, LVL, LSL, comparing those two versus just SPF. You mentioned about what not to put in an exterior wall. I know you're going there.
Go for it. Talk to us.
Yeah, so we all know that at some point a window is going to fail in an exterior wall or a siding, some type of water infiltration. So you got to be careful with engineered woods in your exterior walls, because if you have any water in that wall, you're going to have some issues with swelling and rotting much faster. So, I mentioned to you, we've used a lot of LSL studs on interior walls, but it's interesting talking to them here this morning even about the differences in the strengths. of an LVL versus an LSL and the stiffness of it. But I think we should also talk about I guess it would stand up a little better to water versus just an LSL, when it's just going to be more like OSB.
100%. In fact, let me tell that story real quick, then I want to get back to you on the engineering on those. But when I first started using LSL studs, which kind of looks like an OSB stud, Roseburg doesn't make any of those, but some of the other manufacturers here do. I use them in a bunch of places in a house, including an exterior porch, an unconditioned exterior porch. And I made a video about the mistake I made on this, but I basically misflashed a bunch of these punched openings on an exterior porch. This is a porch that had stucco on the outside, stucco on the inside, and we made redwood trimmed window openings. They got screened, and we made screens for them. So picture this wall. This is a 2x6 OSB stud, basically, with OSB sheathing on the outside. I just had a standard house wrap. I don't need to tell you the name, but a standard house wrap. And I mismanaged the water. Basically, everywhere those punched openings were, the water would sit on the flat sills that I made. And of course, the redwood looked fine a couple years later. But every miter joint, the water was getting in there. And I didn't do a proper sill pan on those. We had just cut openings on there. And so ultimately, the water got in. And it was an uninsulated cavity. You would think, oh, no insulation, no problem. But yet there was no drying action, right? This is like putting a 2x4 into a Ziploc bag, sealing the Ziploc bag shut with a cup of water, and then sitting it out in the sun. How well do you think that 2x4 is going to hold up in that Ziploc bag after a couple years? Not very well. My friend David Nicastro, and I use this all the time on the Build Show, says, if it can't dry, it's going to die. And that's exactly what happened on this project. Catherine, my homeowner, called me 3 or 4 or 5 years later and said, hey, Matt, we're thinking about putting this house in the market. We're thinking about moving back to Houston. But I've got this issue around all my redwood windows. They're all cracked. The caulking's cracked. And I was like, oh, I'm sure it just is, just some touch-up that we need there. No big deal. So I go up there and I check it out. And I drop my rot detection device, which I don't have on me because I'm flying, but it's a 3-inch Benchmade that I use wherever I am looking for rot. And I'm poking around and it's solid, and all of a sudden, my knife goes all the way into the windowsill. I was like, I think we have more than a caulking issue here, Catherine. And of course, this was on my dime. It was like right after the recession, 2014. I'm still paying off the giant debt I had from the spec house that I finally sold for a $300,000 loss. And now all of a sudden I realize this lady's porch is 100% rotted. I pull it open, and it was really interesting. I used LSL studs in a bunch of locations, but in a few places, I also used some solid SPF. And funny enough, the solid SPF had some rot. It's not like it wasn't rotted, but the LSL studs that I had that got wet and couldn't dry, it was like vertical mulch at that point. They were in terrible, terrible condition. And it wasn't a good application for it in terms of being tall walls. The problem was bad water management detailing. And ultimately, anything would have failed there. But it did make me go, okay, if I'm going to use these LSLs, and I still use them a lot, and I use, if you saw any of the videos, my entire house that I built for my personal family has Roseburg LVLs for all the studs. But what I did differently is I managed the water really, really well. And that's the big difference. I'm curious for you, Will. We've talked about this a lot. In fact, we made a video about some water testing we did on your houses. Yep. How much confidence do you have, let's say, in the Huber Zip system for keeping your LVL studs on the inside of the house dry?
I would say it's getting better, right? That's a loaded question. It's a loaded question. So Matt and I had the privilege of testing a house recently with a fire truck. So that's a previous career of mine. But anyway, we got those guys to come out and spray our envelope with a couple thousand gallons of water, and it held up crazy well. I was actually very surprised at even how good it did. And now we're moved into doing rain screens, so our cladding, I think more confidence now than ever, I feel like. But right. I still think for the longevity of the building, you have to really, if you're going to have engineered wood in your exterior wall, you have to really pay attention to those details to make sure that water doesn't come in and cause that issue.
That's right. I mean, no matter what, honestly, whether it's engineered or not, we've got to manage that water. True. But talk to me about tall walls in particular. We were talking about this earlier. Yep. I think tall walls in particular is a place that a lot of builders might consider going to LVLs. What are the benefits of that in your mind of going to tall walls out of LVLs?
Well, so we touched on it briefly about the drywall not having that bow. So you got a dimensionally stable piece of wood. That's incredible. But we also talked about the strength. And I didn't realize until this morning, we talked about the differences in like an LSL versus LVL. You're going from like a 1.4 E stiffness roughly to a 2.4. So it's a considerably amount stronger. And we build on the lake. That's primarily what we do. We have big gable walls facing the water. There's tons of glass in it. But you think about, it's a tall wall, sure, so we want it to be nice and straight. But also, when you take away half of it with glass or 3/4 of it with glass, the added strength of that LVL stud, I think, is something that we should all really pay more attention to.
Yeah, for sure. And in fact, that's my first intro to a full LVL framed house. I did one for an engineer client a couple years ago. This guy named Jeff, who was one of my smartest clients ever, who was just feeding me, hey, did you know about X, Y, and Z material or product? And I was like, no, actually, I don't know about that. So we framed his entire house with LVL studs. And then he also, because of his engineering background, was really specific on both glue and nails for his Advantex sheathed walls on the outside. And I don't know the exact numbers. I'd have to review them.
Really cheap, right?
No, it was not inexpensive.
Super inexpensive house?
No, not inexpensive at all. Back then, though, this was a while ago, we had to get them, we couldn't get pre-cuts like we can today. So I had all these LVL shipped out in 16 or 18 footers. And the poor frame carpenters, it's their first time ever framing with engineered lumber. And by the way, LVLs are heavier typically than, let's say, SPF lumber for sure, which is a pretty lightweight piece of wood. Those poor guys had to pre-cut everything before they could start framing on the job site. Tim, today you can call BFS and get your order pre-cut from the factory, so you can just get a stud pack of 9-foot pre-cuts or 10-foot pre-cuts dropped off. And then, by the way, they told us lead time on that wheel was what?
Like 1 to 2 weeks.
1 to 2 weeks, not a big deal at all. But back to the story, that house, we actually glued all the Advantex sheathing to the LVL studs. And I don't think they make this nail anymore, but we used Hurricane nails. Have you guys ever framed with those before? Do they make those anymore?
Timmy knows.
Timmy knows. Come see Timmy afterwards on Hurricane nails. But it's a nail that had kind of a kind of spiraled shank and a pretty thick body, so that it had really good strength from a shear perspective. And so we had all these LVL studs with, I can't remember if it was a 2.1E or 2.4E, plus 5/8 Advantex sheathing that was glued and nailed on. The house was built like a brick house. I mean, it was unbelievable. And it specifically was intended by this homeowner to be just shy of being able to take Category 5 winds. And this is Central Austin. We don't get Category 5 hurricanes. Like Wade Paquin, when he frames houses, is like, oh yeah, this house will be hit by a hurricane probably next year. We don't have that. But it was a crazy wake up for me to go, oh wow, I didn't realize that I could get much higher values. And there's production builders today, even 10 miles from my house, that are still framing with cardboard sheathing basically. So this is a big deal for me to realize, oh my gosh, we can go a lot higher in our shear values than just, let's say, 1/2-inch plywood, let's say, or CDX out there in the walls. I'm going to put you on the spot because I didn't prep you for this, Brian. But Brian does all the accounting. In fact, he does AP and AR for, he's a one-man band when it comes to the accounting systems at Pioneer Builders. Can you give us any idea of what cost might look like on this and how that might make sense or not make sense for one of your houses?
So the short answer is no, not off the top of my head. But just to talk a little bit about some of the other factors involved, because I'm pretty sure nobody here is going to build an LVL sheath or a studded house with Advantex sheathing. I mean, money is an object for most people that we build for. So putting the engineered lumber, in my opinion, where it makes sense is the thing to do. So like for us, we did a house, priced it out, and it's called intermediate framing. So instead of having full depth headers at all of your windows, your the load isn't too strong there typically. So the depth is a little bit shallower, and then you have some insulation. What we did is we did LVL headers, which are thinner, but still super strong. And then the balance of that you can make up for with insulation. So thermally, you get a better performing house. So if you're doing a HERS rating, Energy Star, performance path for the code instead of prescriptive, you can start figuring out where you can save money and yet still get a better house. So if you want somebody to build everything with LVL studs, my brother's our lead framer, I don't want him to hurt me. So I don't want him to have to deal with all of that stuff. But in the right application, it makes a lot of sense. When it comes to dimensional floor joists, they're going to be cheaper, but you can't get the spans and you can't specify the strength rating that you would like.
Yeah, the L over 360 you're looking for.
Exactly. So you can design your floor for a performance metric, or sometimes, depending on what your floor system is, you take that into consideration instead of, well, you just might not even be able to get the joists.
Yeah.
We did have one situation where lumber was just astronomical, so we changed the floor system completely from one house to another. So to me, it's know what you're using, where you're going to use it. You're not going to use a utility grade 1x4 for your studs. It doesn't make sense. But you're not going to use an LVL to shore up your concrete when you're doing a sidewalk. So you just want to make sure when you're designing it, what are all of the tools in your toolbox, and then pick what makes sense. And then sometimes you look at what the market is calling for. If lumber's astronomical, you might have to change and just design it properly.
Let's talk headers. You brought something up that I didn't even think about that I think is worth mentioning here, which is going from solid sawn headers to engineered lumber for headers. What's the advantages? Actually, let me ask Will first, and I'm gonna come back to you. Are you guys using typically solid sawn for headers?
No, we're using LVLs, and that's actually when he brought that up. I was over here thinking about that, but we see a lot, and most people have seen it for years, and you still see it in your neighborhoods that you're building in, where people are using just nominal lumber for headers. So you have two 2x10s, two 2x12s stacked up, and all I think about is the thermal loss and the bridging that we're getting there. And we might be getting ahead of ourselves, but talking about advanced framing stuff that we're, I think, this afternoon going to be speaking of here. When you go to a 2x6 wall and 24-inch spacing on your studs, and then all of a sudden you just have one LVL stud, the amount of insulation you're now gaining back into your headers, it's really significant on a whole house with a lot of windows anyway. So we made that move a few years ago. I mean, it's every house.
And Bryan, beyond the efficiency benefit or the loss benefit, I'd love to know from your perspective, what's the benefit from the maintenance, from the kind of callback perspective? Because I think you guys are unique in that you see your houses and are in your houses for years to come after you guys are done framing and finishing that house. What have you seen over the years in terms of callbacks, drywall cracking, or reduction of those potentially by going to engineered headers?
Honestly, we don't get much callbacks when it comes to that either way. I haven't seen a difference. What I would say is if we can make things easier for the installers, everybody's happier. So on one house, pricing it out, imagine a big 4x8 chunk of beam that you have to keep cutting, transporting it, installing it, lifting it. It's so much harder on the body than in that case using the, I don't know what it is, 1.125 by 8 or by 10. You get a big long length, you get to cut it to fit, and you carry that to where you're installing your wall. It's so much easier on the body. I think when Timmy priced it out, it was like $80 more to go for the headers to be 4x8 Doug fir to the LVL. $80 doesn't make any kind of a difference, and it's so much easier to install. So it's not just about the end user, it's also who's putting together the house. But if it was a full studded house, totally different scenario. Way harder, your nails are gonna be harder to get through, and it's gonna be more frustrating for the guys.
Yeah, another interesting thing that you guys face up in the Pacific Northwest that I don't as much is rain all day long through certain seasons. When I worked in Portland, Oregon, the old joke was if the California framers came up to Oregon, they'd be hungry because they'd never work. Because if it rained 10 drops in this circle, they went home. In Oregon, when I worked there, it would rain every day for 6 weeks until we got a break, and then we'd have a nice cloudy day for a break, was all we got. So our houses would get absolutely soaked through the wintertime framing season. And the reason why I started making videos and why I got interested in building science, because in 2001, the big news story on NBC Nightly News was mold. And back then, mold was a covered event by your homeowner's insurance. And so when I was working in Portland, Oregon, I was with a semi-custom builder. We had all these houses we framed in the rain, and then we didn't know much about building science. The code called for a vapor retarder or vapor barrier. We were putting visqueen plastic on the inside of those houses, and then any one of those houses that you had to do service on a year later would either have mold in the cavity because our studs were at 20+% moisture content with no way to dry inside or out, or they might have, some of them actually had some real wet rot because we'd have a lot of, let's say, corner posts that got wet and they had no way of drying. We would totally seal them up in that Ziploc bag that I was talking about. So one of the big things we did as a builder in 2002, 2003, this is 20 years ago now, was realize, hey, we should actually check the moisture content of our houses before we move on to that next phase of construction. And I don't know if this is true in Seattle, but in Portland, Oregon, there's a whole cottage industry of people you can hire to dry and test your houses. They will use a house full of fans. They'll use moisture testers at various locations through the house, and they'll make sure that those studs are somewhere around 13% or less before they move on to the next stage of construction. And so one of the issues that we found was that just moving from solid sawn lumber that would absorb a lot of moisture and would swell on us and then would shrink over time meant that we got a lot of callbacks. Almost every window in those houses at the 1 year mark had that 45-degree angle drywall crack that we were coming back to fix. And so for us, moving to engineered for headers meant that we had a lot less callbacks because now those studs weren't absorbing that moisture. They were solid, they were unchanging in their dimensions, and now we had a lot less drywall crack callbacks. Is that something you guys have noticed at all?
It is. I mean, we actually swapped over to, I don't know, it's probably been 3 or 4 years ago. As soon as our envelope gets put together, the dehues come out. So not only do we get rain too, believe it or not, in Alabama, it still rains a lot. But we have this thing called humidity. You know about that.
Yeah, we have a lot of humidity too.
So as soon as we get our envelopes put together, the dehues come out and we start drying it out. And that is where the callbacks have really changed for us. We went from like caulking that crown molding for the 16th time because we didn't understand why it kept cracking to all of a sudden those problems have gone away just by simply drying out the house. So we could talk all day just on drying out your envelope before covering it up. But to your point, if an engineered LVL stud is less absorptive than an SPF stud, then that's also helping. Yeah, it's going to dry faster, right? There's less moisture to dry out. So
I'd love to hear your take on that drying. We've never talked about this before, Brian. In fact, this might make a great Build Show Network video for you. What are you guys doing in terms of drying houses or making sure that you don't have, soaked lumber when you move on to that next stage of construction?
Well, one of the jokes I like to make is we've done everything wrong at least once. So we are like the accumulation of at least 1 million mistakes. So we've done it wrong before, but you talk about the cottage industry to test it and to dry it. That's us. Like we are that person. Over time, I mean, just buy yourself a little moisture meter and you'll actually get the feel for how those pins penetrate the lumber, how dry it is. Yeah, it's got the meter, but if it's wet, those pins just slide right into the lumber. But when it's dry, you can't get it in. You can bend your pin if it's dry enough and hard enough. So that's one of the big things. He deals with air conditioning when it comes to conditioning his houses. For us, we use the either the Huber zip system sheathing to dry it in quickly. We also always have overhangs, so we're not doing super modern houses. Or if we have to, we'll just have underlayment put on, try to get the roof on as quick as possible. We don't have a lot of latent heat. We don't have a lot of humidity in our climate. Once we get it closed off, it starts naturally drying. If you stop where that moisture source is coming from, but for us, Once we get the windows in, depending on the time of year, what we do is we've just got a furnace. I don't know if it's a 40K BTU, 40,000 BTU furnace.
Electric, I'm assuming?
All electric. Again, we've done everything wrong. Timmy will tell you, at my house, we had a torpedo heater, propane. We're trying to dry out the basement, and we used probably Tyvek or something over.
Not everybody
opening.
knows. Tell them about propane and those torpedo heaters.
One of the things that like we know now, but we didn't at the time, you're actually putting moisture back into the air as well. So we had rain coming off of the Tyvek because it was so humid. If you walk down into the basement with glasses, they would fog up. I mean, totally wrong. Eventually, we upgraded to kerosene, way cleaner, but an absolute nightmare to have to go buy, transport, dump out. It stinks. Eventually, we have just a dedicated electric furnace. It's got a reusable, washable filter on it. It's pure dry heat. And so if you can get that warm enough in the house, as my voice is cracking.
Warm enough.
Yeah. I'm becoming a man, Matt.
When you finally get to your 20s, Brian, I'm excited to see where you go in life. You have a bright future, young man.
I appreciate it. Well, so anyway, the moisture will start coming out of the studs, out of the floor, as long as you get your envelope closed up. And if it's cold enough, cold air typically is dry air, you can literally open your windows for a little bit, let that air circulate out, get some air handlers going, close up the house again, and then the air will become saturated with moisture. You replace that with the cold air, and before you know it, you're getting closer to your EMC, equilibrium moisture content, which is what a house is going to get eventually. You just want to accelerate that before you put your finishes on.
The tip that I heard there that I think is a really good one, and we're not at the Huber booth, but you could do this with a variety of materials, is that when you're framing those houses, you're making sure that your roof deck is dried in as soon as possible. And I also heard he's got overhangs on his houses, so he's got a big umbrella on. So once that umbrella is on, he's good to go. Those houses are going to be kept dry from that point on in construction. That's huge. Will, I got a question for you, which doesn't relate to Brian because they do their own framing, but you and I subcontract out framing. Any tips for these guys on finding a good framer, on feeding and caring for a good framer, on ways that you've got your framers to comply with doing something a little different than maybe what other builders in your area are doing? How do you bid those projects out? Some of those kinds of questions.
Well, you have to pay them. That's the thing. So a lot of the framers in our area that we had to deal with for a while were used to doing more what we consider spec homes, and those guys they were so resistant. I mean, I remember swapping from the house wrap over to a fluid applied at the factory panel like Huber. That alone was a big step in solving that. We finally got really lucky. We got a good framing crew that's a little bit smaller, but they're very open to learning new ideas, new innovations, and so we've been able to work with them a lot. And even with our truss manufacturer, he is a big asset to us and works with our framers. But when it comes to using engineered woods and LVLs and LSLs and you just videoed all this.
I'm just videoing this.
Yeah.
We'll do those on Instagram later.
I know. Yeah, no pressure here. But anyway, I think just having that relationship with them, taking them swag, taking them lunch, working, that relationship with your framer could be a lot bigger than just explaining to them how to use a new product. They have to trust you. They have to know that you're going to take care of them. I think as long as you can pull that off of your framers, you can have good success. But again, we're not doing production builds. We're doing, we're probably framing 7 or 8 homes a year for us. So it's one crew that we take care of, and it works good for us. But I don't know. You probably have some good tips for that too.
I'd piggyback on that by saying I tell my clients, look, I'm a cost plus builder. And so I almost always very early on in my interviews with clients get this question, hey, are you going to 3-bid my house to 3 different framers or 3 different drywall contractors or 3 different lumber yards or whatever? And I tell them, look, Mr. and Mrs. Client, you hired me because I'm an expert. And because you decided that I was the best builder for you, right? And actually, this is a longer story than we have time for, but check out our videos to hear about our pre-construction services agreement.
Yep.
I don't bid houses. I got hired early on as basically a consultant, and that way I can share all my pricing and all my bids with them. So when we started talking about 3 bids, I'll say, look, I really just have one framing contractor. I have this contractor that I really like. He's an expert. He and his team have been working on my houses for many years. They know what I like. They know how I like it. Sometimes we change the specs. Sometimes we keep the same specs. But they charge me very fairly, and then I charge you very fairly in a cost-plus scenario where they're not worried about bidding something and putting a high number on it because they're worried about losing money because they've never done this engineered lumber before, let's say. And at the same token, they don't underbid it where I'm going to put them out of business and hold their feet to the fire on something that they made a mistake on. So what I do is every year in January around this time, in fact, I'm not sure if that meeting's happened already, but we get together with that contractor of mine that I've had a multiple year, decade really long relationship now. And I say, okay, what are our rates going to be this year, and how are we going to do that? And maybe he wants to go up 30%, and I say, no, that's not going to work. I got all these projects in process that I've already estimated based on this rate or this whatever markup. And so we decide together what that number is going to be for the year for his daily rate, for his hourly rates, for his weekly rate. And then I've got historic data of how long it takes for me, generally speaking, to frame this style of house and this square footage, because I can look back on the other 30 houses we've done with them and see how long it took us to frame those houses. And so what I end up doing is putting basically a cost plus guess, an estimate in for my framing labor. And that way, if I make changes, if the client makes changes, everybody gets treated very fairly. And I make sure to have that conversation ahead of time. So wrapping this back up to engineered lumber, that means that my framer, when I said, hey, I want to frame this whole house in engineered lumber. I want to do this whole house in LVLs. This is, now I'm a couple of houses in where I've done the entire house out of engineered lumber. He's not saying, oh man, I got to think about that. I'm going to figure out, what I'm going to add to the bid. He's like, great, that sounds good. I'm able to look back at my historic data, and I figured, it might be X amount of time more, 5% more time, whatever it is, pre-cuts or not pre-cuts. And basically, I'm able to share that with my clients and say, look, you're handling both the risk and you're getting the reward of us not paying an exorbitant rate, us paying a very fair rate, and having expert people on the job site. I'm curious from your perspective, Bryan, because you guys do a lot of self-perform. What's your experience in terms of framing and labor and estimating?
Can you be more specific?
I guess really in this question of, hey, I'm thinking about trying a new product or a new material. How do I budget for that? Like, we've never used LVL studs before, and all of a sudden, hey, I want to go ahead and have us frame those in the kitchen and in the bathroom, and we want to use this in this tall wall. I'm curious from your perspective, number one, how do you figure out what that's going to cost from a material perspective? But then also, how do you estimate that on a labor perspective? And any wisdom for this crowd on that, being a second generation builder and having the benefit of having dad also pass that wisdom down to you?
Yeah, I mean, some of it's going to be the intangibles, having to cull through your lot, what you need to get rid of, what you don't need to get rid of. When you've got a pre-manufactured product, in general, if it's meeting its quality control specs, you can rely upon that. So there's going to be, how do you quantify how much money you're saving? I have no idea. But what we do that's pretty easy is just have the engineered company give us, let's see, what do? They design it, and then we get a price from the lumberyard. So if you're doing 2x10s for your floor system, you just get that as a price. And then if you're getting the 10-inch I-joists, you get that as a price. But that doesn't account for all of those intangibles. If it's a real new product, because let's face it, these are just little rectangles stuck up on edge. It's not a huge difference as opposed to like a brand new product that you've never used before, or a system that you've never done. That's where you want to talk to the installers. I try to come to the table with a trade, whoever it is, electrical, MEP, with 90% of it figured out, and then I try to know to shut my mouth for 10%. Because I'm not the installer. If you're talking to a guy who knocks tin all day, he's going to know the best way to route his ducks, almost always. So it's best to listen to them, the guys who are actually using the tools, and then come up with the best efficient way to do it. Instead of coming down from on high, no, this is what you need to do because I think that's the way to do it. You're not going to get buy-in. But if everybody is collaborative, it's going to go a lot better.
That's great advice, Brian. Guys, we're about quarter till. We need to leave some time to give you some swag. By the way, will you be our Vanna White and hold up the shirts? We have some co-branded Roseburg Build Show True Work shirts. This one's dirty. I apologize, people. We've got small, medium, large, and extra large. We also have co-branded Build Show hats from our apparel partner True Work. And it's got the Roseburg logo on the side. We'd love to give you one of each. And before we do that, though, stick around. Let's do a little Q&A time. And I've got Matthew Guthrie over here, the Build Show producer, who's got a mic.
Testing.
So Matthew will mic you up. Anybody have any questions that you'd like the three of us to answer in the big format? Don't be shy. We'd love to have you throw a question out. Anybody raise your hand if you got a question. Anybody? Anybody? Question? Questions? Nobody? Everybody just wants this movie. Yeah, go ahead. Matthew, you got one right here. Everybody wants merch.
So, this is specifically for you, Matt. What made you want to go from being the GC on the job to being more of an educator for the rest of the guys in the industry around the country and the world?
So his question is, what made you want to go more from a GC to being an educator? That's a great question. For me, when I started making YouTube videos, 2008, I was frustrated that some of the national publications that I was reading and learning from were very kind of cold climate oriented. And so I just moved to Texas in 2005, and I joined my local home builders association. And at the HBA, there was three men in particular that I had this natural, I really like these guys. They feel like they're my older brothers. Tim Hill, who now is my VP of construction, you've met him before. He's actually starting a podcast pretty soon on the Build Show Network. Ray Tonjes and Joel Katz was the third guy. These guys are about 15 years older than me. And at HBA meetings, I would every week or every other week, let's see, when I'd see them, I'd be like, oh my gosh, Ray, I got this issue with X, Y, and Z in the job. What should I do? Whether it was a contract issue, whether it was a building science question, whether it was a mistake I made. And Ray, being this builder that was 15 years further along in his career than me, was always willing to share with me. Same with Tim and same with Joel. And so I had this mentor-mentee relationship with smarter, older builders. And so for me, I've just carried that on to say, look, if I've made this mistake over the years, there's probably someone about your age, you're probably 30 years old, let's say, who would like to know how to not make the same mistake. And there was nobody doing that on video back when I was your age. It was only magazines, and I felt like those magazines were all about how to build a house in the freezing north, which I was not building in. So really, that's the genesis for me of YouTube. And now I have the incredible benefit of shooting videos with these guys on BuildShowNetwork.com. So now, if you're building in the Pacific Northwest and you are building, there's so many amazing things to say about Brian and his brother Tim, but these guys are second-generation builders. I don't even know how old you are, Brian. Are you 40 yet?
42.
We got a 42-year-old builder who really has the wisdom of a 52-year-old builder, but the looks of a 32-year-old builder. Because he's that second generation. He got his dad's and mom's wisdom. His parents were involved in the business. He grew up on the job site. You were probably that 15-year-old kid who was sweeping floors and absorbing that information you didn't even realize. So now that you're 42, I'd put you toe-to-toe with any 52-year-old builder in terms of your knowledge, your wisdom, the way that you carry and handle yourself, the way that you deal with your prospects or your clients. And that wisdom now, Brian is sharing with us on BuildShowNetwork.com. And Will, if you've seen any of our videos, Will has a really interesting background. He was a firefighter, had a whole nother career as a firefighter, and was building on the side and on the weekends and nights, probably working 90 hours a week during that time. And realized, I really enjoy this. There's something, I suspect you guys are like this too. There's something about building that's so tangible, right? You go home at the end of the day and you're like, I did something that's really of a lasting value and that society values and needs. And you know what? I'm really excited to drive my grandchildren by this house. And how cool is that when you finish that project and you drive away and you build it really well? Whether you built a $100,000 house or a $100 million house, if you build it well and you put your craftsmanship and your heart into it, there's that feeling about that house and about that project that will last every time you drive by it. And I still do that with my kids. My kids aren't that old yet, but I have houses now that I built as my own builder in 2005 that I get to drive by. And I have that feeling of pride, that feeling of, man, I did my best. Now, is that the same house I built today, 15 years later? No, but I built that house to the best of my ability, the best of my wisdom and my integrity at that time. And that's a feeling that not all industries get. I have friends that are doctors and lawyers and customer service people on the interwebs. They don't go home with that same feeling. They didn't do things that people are going to live in for the next 100 years. And of course, our houses will get remodeled and changed. But the fact that those houses are still going to be around and people are going to love them and care for them, and if they're built well and if they're beautiful, they might be around several hundred years from now. What other industry could you work on that what you're working on today, a third or fourth generation down from your line, might get to work on that same house? How cool is that?
So I guess to add to your point, Michael, right? So I think I'm not putting words in his mouth, but at least for me, like once you can teach something, then you learn it, right? And so for me, even in the fire service, I was very passionate about that. So we can have some more conversations after it's over if you want to talk more, but I think that's a big driver for all of us.
We should probably wrap it up, guys.
All right, friends, thanks for sticking around for this long video. Big thanks to Roseburg for sponsoring and letting us have the stage. And I appreciate you guys sitting through this whole 45-minute or so talk. If you want to know more about Bryan or Will, of course, you can go over to Build Show Network and find out more about them. But when it comes to Roseburg, we're using a bunch of their different engineered products on our Build Show Build Boston series that we're on like episode 4, 5, 6 right now with Steve Basic. So go over to buildshownetwork.com and catch up on all the action over there. Guys, really appreciate your support. Hit that subscribe button below if you're not a current subscriber. We've got new content here every Tuesday and every Friday. Follow us on TikTok or Instagram. Otherwise, we'll see you next time on The Build Show.